I think probably heard about conscious hacking pretty early on, 2011, something like that. And I immediately took to the phrase, probably like a lot of people. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about why, because that partly has to do with the larger currents within which consciousness hacking as an organization and as a self-conscious movement have taken place. I mean, I kind of immediately perked up because I recognized that it was a very clever and earnest formulation of what I consider a very California/Bay Area stream, although it involves things from all over the world and certainly all over the United States, but was really concentrated here, which is a kind of radical but also pragmatic exploration of consciousness. So when people think about the counterculture, there's sort of a superficial view of just kind of like, it's all about ecstasy and irrationality and mysticism, and yeah, that stuff is all going on, but in some ways the more interesting and arguably the more lasting and influential, not altogether in positive ways, side of this story is its pragmatism. So if there were crazy Dionysian, acid tests going on, there were also, the Whole Earth Catalog and the construction of tools and the development of alternative communities using new technologies and new systems thinking and a new sort of sense of building systems that could become platforms for transformation. And so there's a whole builder, hacker, bricoleur, systems mixing experimentalism that's going on as these other kinds of more far out and more visible explorations are happening. And these days, that what was sort of not noticed as much before is now in some ways even more obvious, because there's sort of a story among historians in Silicon Valley and increasingly in people who think about technology that actually the most important outgrowth of this whole current of the West Coast counterculture is the way it set in motion and influenced the creation of Silicon Valley as we know it now, certainly of Apple computers and certainly of Google in certain ways, and that you can trace these countercultural ideas into cyberculture in a wide variety of ways. So what I really liked about consciousness hacking was it was kind of like an almost nostalgic flavor of some of that 70s experimentalism when people were going into biofeedback, when they were thinking about altered states as zones of consciousness that could be explored, experimented, tweaked, twisted, understood, reframed, expanded, amplified. That whole idea that alongside the sort of mystical recovery of ancient religions and religious traditions in particular, there was the sense that there was a kind of mystical empiricism, a sort of inner empiricism, that you could bring the secular values of clarity, peer discussion, a lack of supernatural belief systems into these mysterious realms that kind of pushed back against normal everyday rational consciousness. So there's this kind of secular line, and even the phrase altered states of consciousness is itself an expression of this current. It comes out, it's in University of Davis in 1969. Charles Tart gathers all this stuff together, and he puts together all these articles about states of consciousness that up to that point, most psychologists and most anthropologists thought were insane, not really worth thinking about, basically valueless. And he's like, no, we should be paying attention to this stuff. So even the idea of altered states of consciousness is something not quite mystical, but more than rational or different than rational, is kind of part of this zone. So when I heard consciousness hacking, I was like, oh, they're like picking that up and they're fusing it with this idea of the hacker. And then I'll do a little brief riff on that and then hand it on. the hacker is a it's a fascinating way to understand the history of computer technology, is just to track that term. And Stephen Levy's book, Hackers, is still a really, really awesome thing, because you get to see in that book where the idea of the hacker comes from, its roots inside institutional computing and MIT in the 1960s, and the way it then gets expressed through countercultural values, people who are building new community systems, who are creating kind of DIY cultures of exploring these possibilities with the idea of transformative art and culture in mind, and then sort of how it goes from there. So for me, in a somewhat nostalgic way, because of course the nature of the term has changed, and hackers have become incorporated into aspects, particularly the security aspects of the computer industry, in ways that are different than what the original constellation of terms is, or at least a development of it. But I would say that that one of the core elements of it is that it's working against the grain, that there's a kind of a little bit of punk rock in it, a resistance or a exploration of using systems and exploring systems in ways that the designers of those systems did not intend or foresee. And so it can be done in a adolescent fuck you kind of way, and it can be done in just a kind of clever hey, we could do it this way and save all this time, or we can create all of the creativity of using what are become increasingly complex systems, and so therefore increasingly hackable systems. But there was very much a sort of ethos to it. And that ethos had a countercultural quality, even if it wasn't explicitly countercultural. It had a sort of DIY, both community and you're on your own, kid, let's try to figure it out yourself quality, and a sort of exuberance in the messiness of the process itself. It had its hands dirty. It was in the guts of the vehicle. It was getting the grease on underneath the fingernails kind of approach. And that was a sort of aesthetic about it, which for me was a beautiful way to think about how do we restore or respark or reframe this current of empirical mysticism, of hands-on, DIY, secular, but expanded and ferocious and a little bit punk rock. How do we bring that into this question of consciousness? So I was really into that, and in some ways, that's what was going on. In other ways, other things were going on. But that's what really gassed me, and I could sort of see it in, hanging out with Mikey, and the first times that I was exposed to the scene, there was a lot of people who were kind of on that wavelength. And then the way that it organically developed also seemed to suggest that same kind of DIY, collective, old school, hacker, bulletin board, 2600, that whole kind of world that I was familiar with because I've been writing about technology since the early 1990s. So I was kind of familiar with that vibe, that almost cyberpunk kind of energy. So that's what got me excited about it, and I'm saying that partly just to kind of talk a little bit about how consciousness hacking as a group and a movement fits into our more immediate cultural history, whose consequences we're now involved in very different ways too, as things speed up and become more concerning in a lot of ways. But we'll get to that. Sir.
How do you follow Erik? Sorry. Thank you for that history. That was beautiful. I guess I'll just talk about a personal experience that I recall being quite little kid in let's say Christmas 1968, like a little kid, and going to my next door neighbor's house. We got our gifts, they got our gifts, and then we went at our own homes, and then I went over next door with my brother and sisters and so on to see their family and see what they got. And they were busting out this brand new album, a double album of music, and putting it on their record player, and everyone gathered around And there's actually a scene of this in a movie, but I've lived this scene. It's like they put on the record Tommy and like sacredly moved the needle and dropped it on that, and we all just listened, you know. And there was a real sense that you were going to have your consciousness transformed by listening to this music, and they were not kidding, you know. It's like this is like a literal spiritual moment. And whatever you think of that music or any music, you know, the mood of seriousness and possibility was totally there, and the idea that you were going to listen to the music and it would change your consciousness in a positive way. And, you know, also right around that time, you've got like 2001: A Space Odyssey coming out, where the whole idea is, you know, by traveling on a spaceship out to Jupiter and the moon of Jupiter, you have this massive awakening, right? The person, just by traveling in a spaceship to see this piece of technology, the monolith, has their mind utterly blown, right? So again, the technology is going to open your mind in this super positive way where you see yourself as a baby in a really ugly hotel. But, you know, there was just this mood in the culture, and especially the counterculture, but even the culture at large, that there were technological things that could happen that would open you up. And some of them were, in a way, just modernizations of the idea that, you know, if you listen to the right symphony, you're going to, you know, have a sacred vision, or if you watch this particular opera, you will be opened up to some kind of deeper level of feeling or whatever. I think this idea, depending on what you call technology, just tracks, right, all through history. And at the same time, and various cultures, and at the same time, I think right around, you know, 1968, 1970, there was a real emphasis on that idea. And, you know, much later, going to college, I read Robert Anton Wilson and just completely bought into the idea that if you take LSD, you will, you know, enough, you will have a permanent change of consciousness, or, you know, it will free your mind from its chains. And that's very much the image of the rock music, and I think 2001, and also of certainly Robert Anton Wilson's vision of LSD. So I tried that about, I don't know, maybe like 800 times, and probably more than that. And it did, in fact, have some consciousness-changing effects that were amazing. And but then by that time, you know, like if you were into these things, you were also into the beats. And Burroughs and Brian Geisen were doing this really weird thing of making a dream machine, right? And what's a dream machine? How many people have heard of the dream machine, right? I'm impressed. So, you know, it's basically you've got a turntable, like a record turntable. Notice most of these stories involve a record turntable. And you make like a tube, a cardboard tube, and you cut cool sort of Moroccan-themed holes in it, because Brian Geisen and William Burroughs lived in Morocco. And these holes are spaced in such a way that when you hang a light bulb down into that tube from above and you turn the record player on, it blinks. You get flashing light, and it's flashing light at a, you know, predetermined brainwave frequency, right? Usually like alpha theta, right in the middle there. And so, you know, they had this idea, we're going to totally just make this crazy piece of hack technology, and it's going to cause you to dream, or to have waking dreams, or to see visions or whatever. And, you know, I'm sure that if you're doing as much ayahuasca as Burroughs was doing, that helps. But we tried these things out, and they worked, you know. You could really start to notice these amazing states of mind. And by the, you know, let's say, early 80s. I was trying out the blinky lights in like the, you'd get a mask, like it's basically like sort of a diving mask that's closed in the front and got some LEDs in there, and you've got this crude controller, and same thing, right? Blinky lights. And because I was living in Boulder at the time, I got a chance to I accidentally bumped into Burroughs, and he was hanging out outside at Naropa, like just chilling, and I didn't know he was going to be there, and I was sort of like, oh my God, it's a demigod of the universe. But he's actually really relaxed and totally easy to hang out with. So I started talking with him about these brain machines, and he was really into it. And he was like, oh yeah, I've tried that exact one, and gives you these great visions and stuff. It was cool. And right about that time, the whole cyberpunk thing happened, and that for me was sweet. Like, I just fully dove in. And again, what's the whole idea in that cultural context? Like Erik was describing, you're going to use technology not only to like free the masses and break the chains of oppression in the world and kind of have this Star Trek utopia thing happen, but also you're going to free your mind in various ways and maybe have some crazy superpowers, at least in some kind of, alternate virtual reality to boot. And so it just keeps going, right? It keeps going. And then for me, the really interesting thing is I started working with Shinzen Young. That's my, I've been meditating forever, but he's probably like my main spiritual teacher. And from the first day I was talking to the guy, he's like, we have to make this easier. Meditation is too hard for people. We have to build machines that will help them to meditate. And every retreat I went to, which was zillions for years and years and years and years and years, he would always emphasize this. We've got to do this. We must take meditation out of, the monastery or out of just the thing that only privileged people can do, and we have to democratize it and give it to everyone. And the only way to do that is with brain machines, as we would have called them. And now, that Shinzen's down there at the University of Arizona together with Jay Sanguinetti, and they have a lab, and they're doing, they're like zapping people's brains, mainly Shinzen's brain, but a lot of other people too, a lot. And so all of this vision, of like kind of the sort of the anarcho-communist, super artistic, libidinous, hypersexual revolution of freeing your mind, to me is like completely, in a utterly countercultural and totally like revolutionary way, is embedded in this idea of consciousness hacking, right? It's been there forever. It's always turned me on about it. And right about like a couple of years ago, I just started going, oh no, So that's kind of like a personal history of how I've sort of gotten involved with this and what I see happening, and I'll just hand it back to Erik.
Sure,
and when I say that, oh no, what comes up?
What comes up? Yeah, that's a good way in. Well, I have to admit that there's a little bit of the oh no is like, oh, like here they come, and by they I don't mean lots more people, but I mean carpetbaggers, basically. I've been thinking about that category a lot lately. But that's, in a way, not the most interesting story. I think one thing that seemed really cool when they were asking about where people are coming from is we have a really wide mix here. We probably have some people who are pretty cynical, pretty critical, pretty deep questions about our current technological moment, and then we probably have people who are pretty invested in like really nifty specific technologies that feel really good about, and they have their positive reasons to think it could do some good in the world. A lot of people in between, and so it raises this interesting question of how to have this conversation without just starting to talk about politics or political economy or the kinds of op-ed concerns about data surveillance and all this kind of stuff. Like how to not ignore all of the elephants in the room, but also still honor what to me is still in that current of consciousness hacking as an idea, and to a certain extent as an organization, and certainly as a organic group of people who are interested in exploring these things. And it's not the easiest thing to do, because we are, of course, talking about the problems of what happens when capitalism goes into overdrive, and when the tendrils of, let's call it, well, you could call it control, or you could call it stimulation, or you could call it monitoring, sensing, when that apparatus gets more and more intimate, closer and closer to the very seat of you. Your memories, your affects, your experiences, your thoughts, your predilections, all of that stuff. It's like, closer and closer, monitoring. And of course, if you start to monitor, you might want to start nudging a little bit. You talk to people who are deep in this stuff, and I've had a couple of interesting conversations. When I go to the tech parties, I was like, look for the one who seems a little alienated, and you go, hey, what do you do? And like, oh, well, yeah, blah, blah. And then I'll just nudge him in kind of dystopian directions, not to be just negative and dark, but because I want to see what their story is. You got to be invested in it, but you're paying attention, so you see the dark potentials. And I remember some guy who was at Apple, and that's all I'll say, was talking about just the nudge, and the word nudge came up, and then it was just like, yeah, like that's what's happening. That's where we're going, nudging. So you can, take consciousness hacking, the idea of using brain machines, the idea of using wearables, the idea of life hacking, all that stuff, and you can put a box around it and look at it in terms of what's happening to the individual and see all this totally cool stuff. Oh my God, that's so cool. I totally love technology to give me like the patterns of my sleep cycle, or what if I can track certain things and relate them to mood shifts and try to find patterns so I can undercut some of the destructive things in myself. Like all that stuff is like, I'm not talking about that being bad. It's just that is now so intimately woven into this larger conundrum that we're in that it's sort of hard to talk about, because I don't want to just go, oh, it's all just it's all just turned over to the man, and we're all kind of stuck in this big capitalist nightmare, though sometimes I feel that way. And at the same time, I feel it would feel wrong to just go, hey, this is really nifty stuff, and we might really actually be able to change consciousness and improve people's mood, and that might even lead them to act better in the world. And I see that dream. And I share it to a certain extent. I certainly share it about meditation. But then if I believe it about meditation and someone can show me a machine that's going to produce these things, do I go down that line? I'm not sure. And so rather than keep going on the political stuff, since we talked about Shinzen, here's the question for you, and whether it's something you talked about with him or how you think about it. And I would phrase it this way. My experience of meditation, of the degree of whatever waking up I've done or working with these things really intently, both psychedelics and meditation and just living, is that it's more and more clear to me that it's not about the states, it's much less about the states or even the experiences than the development of a space, a field within which experiences arise and fall, on the one hand, and also the sheer practice of practice. What does it mean to actually practice as opposed to pressing a button? And there's a materialism in the idea that, oh, if we create a machine that can create certain states more easily so people don't have to sit, and then they can get these states, and then that will help them overcome their negativity, and then they'll be able to be better citizens in the world. And that whole story, I'd like to believe it. But some part of me, a dharmic part of me, is like, isn't the journey the goal? Isn't the very challenge of practice and the confusion part of what makes awakening be a process that we sort of never realize but is also always already with us? And Shinzen seems like someone who I could imagine having, a complicated, an interesting way of responding to that. He's not a simplistic materialist guy like, oh no, we just need to create these certain states in this one region of the brain and then we're going to be good. So whether it's from him or from your working with him or your own perspective, how do you see that, the necessity of that? Or am I just being a kind of romantic holding on to some old framework that maybe isn't necessary anymore?
Yeah, so I can't speak for Shinzen, so I'm speaking for me. But, the fucking world is on fire. We just lost like 1 billion animals in like a 2-day period or 3-day period, like 2 weeks ago. And that was a fucking tragedy beyond, I can't even express how intensely that affected me, but I'm sure it affected all of you as well. And that was just a couple days. And get ready, because we're going to have a whole bunch more of that. A whole bunch more of it real soon. And so, it's one thing when we've got like, hey, a couple thousand years here to hang out in our village and like explore the cool shit with our inner psychology, our inner being, which you're absolutely right about. I mean, I love that, right? I've given my life to that. It's a beautiful thing. But fuck. Like we might not have time for that right now, and to get time for that, we gotta do something. And so, Shinzen's fond of quoting the Dalai Lama, who, specifically said, like, if there was a surgical intervention that would make everyone enlightened, I would tell them to do it today and tell them, that's Buddhism. So, it doesn't get clearer than that.
Yeah.
And, supposedly, I think I'm correct in saying, and his reasoning behind that is exactly the same reason that I'm describing, like, hey, we're really in some trouble here. And the methods that we've been using up to this point don't produce results fast enough for how fast everything is falling apart. And how many people are being hurt, and how much power we have in the hands of, very sane, reasonable people like Donald Trump, who's, a genius. Very stable genius with, all that crazy amount of power in their hands. So, while Shinzen speaks fluent Japanese and Chinese and, has read every single bit of the literature there's a lot of literature, but read a lot of the literature in those traditions, and I certainly really love and appreciate that to the nth degree. There's just a realpolitik reality check that needs to go on here with our sort of notion of this, like how this is supposed to look that comes from like 1100 CE. We're just in a different point right now. And so, in a way, it's almost like, yeah, that would be nice. We're all gonna die in 20 years. We gotta do something now to change people's consciousness reliably, quickly, and in a positive direction. So that's the mood. It's like, well, this might not be the most beautiful expression of this, but this is what we got to do. And certainly the way Shinzen talks about it, and the way I would understand it also, is it's not like, zap, you're enlightened, have a nice day. It would be introducing people to certain states of being, and then giving them a lot of training how to work with that, and what it means in their life, and so it's a hybrid model. But the idea is to take what would formerly take 30, 40 years and make it like 2 years. And make it cheap. Like Shinzen always likes to be like, well, it would be like a community college class that you take for 2 years together with your, brain stuff. So that's kind of the vision, it's just an incredibly important moment in time when we're trying to, like, literally save the world.
Yeah, I can hear that. It's funny how bringing up, it's kind of like, from my mind, the two poles of my dystopian experience is the climate, and then the nature of whatever you want to call it, extractive surveillance capitalism and overdrive. And so when, in a way, you're like, you're playing that card, and then that immediately makes me go, unfortunately, and I wish I wouldn't do that. I'm thinking here of Philip K. Dick novel, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, which remains quite relevant and worth reading. Excuse me?
Perky Pat.
Yeah, Perky Pat, indeed. I was thinking of a different part. It's actually just a little sub-thread where in this world you can go through certain procedures that make you, they give you psychic powers, powers of telepathy, powers of predictive. There's a lot of interesting prediction stuff in it, but it's embedded in a market system in which people are competing in order to predict what the desires of customers are going to be. So it's very relevant for a 1965 novel. It's also really hot. So unfortunately, I'm afraid that Three Stigmata is perhaps his most prophetic novel. Anyway, what I'm thinking of is the way in the novel, it's very clear that this capacity to produce advanced, heightened states of consciousness is absolutely and immediately woven directly into capitalist competition, into the zero game, into game theoretic activity. So if let's just go with, okay, we're all going to die in 20 years, we better turn this up really, really fast. What do we do about the fact that in preparation, let's say, for this conversation, I went onto a website that Josh pointed me to that was, conscious hacking without the cool, goofy Santa Cruz, little new agey. I love it. It was just transformative technology, how to invest, who's ahead, whatever. And I just watched.
The monster truck.
Yeah, exactly. I watched, and I just watched the videos. I just decided I'm actually not going to research this. I'm just going to watch all the stream of videos. And it was so problematic in so many ways. And so I'm going, okay, and let's just name a few. One is the problem of lying hype, whatever you want to call it, lying, hyping, marketing, I guess we call it. And the way that not very good science gets crystallized, not very good science done by people who are already in the pockets of the thing gets crystallized into a certain kind of narrative that punctures through the discursive field of too many attention economy things and then gets wrapped into a very nice, attractive package. It's just what you want. It's going to get you through your day. And you're like, I would like that. Okay, so that's one of them. That's like one category of these things. Then what's another one? Well, another one is as part of this transformation, this kind of post-human capital, whatever you want to call it, there's those people who are going to try to run the ship or somehow continue to, be up the chain. And so they got to compete on a level that we don't even those of us who have been struggling our whole lives don't really quite get, because they're going to be competing on a post-human kind of landscape. So that's I'm going to take it all. I'm going to plug it in. I'm going to amp it up. I'm going to maximize my this and maximize my that. And some of those things, a number of them, are precisely the same values and categories that we want as part of liberation. The same stuff along the way, but framed in a different mode. How do we think about that? Well, one is that it returns to, in a way, the controller. Behind this whole conversation about technology and our decisions and our minds and how we relate is this problem of control. Who has control? Are you controlled? Mind control? No, I'm in control because I have tools that'll let me be in control, but my desire to use the tool is maybe I'm not in control in that way. Oh wait, I'm in this really, really complicated, crazy, psychedelic loop that in some sense has always been the case, but is more apparent and visible now. It's the problem of cybernetics. Yes, consciousness and control go together, but where is the locus of control? Is Trump in control? Well, he can do things. He's not really in control of himself or of his power. And then you get into this thing like, okay, where's control? So in exploring the linking of powerful technologies to consciousness, that problem gets intensified radically. So one solution of the anxiety or the tension that's produced by that problem of control is to pretend it doesn't exist and that you, as a sovereign agent, do have control through your reason, through your tool use, and through your own decisions. That's partly true, and it's partly not true. And Buddhism is very much it's partly true, but it's definitely not entirely true kind of school. And that's part of what you're doing when you go into the Dharma is what does it mean to be awake when you realize that these things you thought were you aren't you? Or when you've interpolated things and how do you wake up? How do you make decisions? Is it a decision? I'm not sure anymore. Is it the Tao making the decision? Is it the other Tao making the decision? Because that's what I want. So one of the problems you see with a lot of this stream of transformative technologies is that it's not just selling the technology, it's selling the subjectivity. And the subjectivity is that one who is in control and will be able to manage the turbulence of post-human capitalism by returning these powers to the self that is now a kind of monster self or a monster controller or someone who's able to manage that. And that's an extremely delicious fantasy if you're struggling, if you're poor, if you just got laid off, if the technology you've been working on just went kaput, if all the craziness that we're all in. It's a very attractive story. And the fact that many of those elements that are put together with that subjectivity are the same things that we want for an awakening society. And so how to outgun that if you're trying to scale. So I realize that I tend towards a kind of anarcho withdrawal. Like I'm just gonna go up in the hills with my 10 friends and we're just gonna be sad. And it's kind of defeatist. And that I really admire the people who talk about scale. Like Josh talked about scale. We gotta scale. You're talking about scale. Shin's is talking about scale. You gotta scale. But how to scale when all the scale mechanisms are part of that platforming problem, or maybe not all of them, but a lot of them, and so then I'll just bring it back to a personal question then. I don't know what to do because I'm kind of my whole life has been kind of a sympathetic critic. I've been a sympathetic critic of technology, a sympathetic critic of psychedelia, a sympathetic critic of counterculture. I come from these worlds. I'm also very devoted to clarifying bullshit and to drawing attention to hype and to drawing attention to self-serving behavior and to having that kind of journalistic thing. And I don't know what to do because I start to complain and I hear 20 years, what are you talking about, man? We got to get going. And then I'll go, okay, you're right. Yeah, we got to get going like that guy. They seem to be really working. And then I listen to them and I go, that's just bullshit. That is just fucking bullshit. And some of these things that I was listening to were just shocking. Whatever, just how wisdom traditions are the same thing as these gadgets and all the kind of gadget stuff. And we're not even getting to making fun of gadgets. That's a whole other thing. Maybe we'll get to that in a moment. So that's my conundrum. Can you help me? What do we do?
I just want to go be in the mountains, with, together, or just hang out and complain. It'll be awesome. No, I can't. I mean, I think about, I'm sure several people in this room work for several companies I feel like talking about right now, so I won't use any names, but there are various social media platforms that are about as miserable an experience as they could possibly be. And what's so interesting is with just that crappy ass tool, you get a bad actor in there with some money, and they change the world, right? Everybody who thinks they're so smart and thinks they're making their own decisions and thinks they're in control and thinks they're wise, and they're meditators or whatever, got their consciousness hacked by some, just by some guys in Moldova or whatever. I mean, it wasn't even that hard. And so now I just think, oh yeah, now let's get these incredibly powerful machines on people's heads that can, change their mood entirely. And of course, those things, at least some of them, are going to be, connected to the internet. And then that's when I start going, oh no, where's the bot farm in Croatan that is going to, decide which enlightenment I'm going to have while, emptying my bank account and, turning my internal organs into paper clips or whatever. It's a very grim scenario. And it could just turn out to be the last little possible square inch of reality that capitalism can exploit is that little freedom in your meditation, and they're just going to take that and burn that, before we all die. So I can't really help you out here. It does not look good right now. Of how, because people, who's in control and what their motivations are, and how much, the whole premise of consciousness hacking is that it can really change your mind. Well, that can go two ways. Or that can go different ways. And who gets to decide what that is? It's a big issue. So.
Let's see. Well, I guess I'm trying to make sure to keep the kind of the meditation part in the picture. And one of the critiques I have on that score, leaving aside the big scenario problem, is and we got a little flavor, luckily, from Michael's meditation, which is, there's a lot of different Buddhisms. There's not one Buddhism. There's a lot of different meditations, a lot of different approaches. Some meditators wouldn't recognize this one as being meditation. And one way of thinking about it, if you are meditators, is to ask yourself seriously, what is the difference between what happens to me and trance? What is trance? What does it mean to be in a trance or entranced? How do you navigate that difference? Because it's actually not really very clear. I mean, deep samadhi and hypnotic trance, there's a lot of overlap there. And so we have to recognize that even by meditation is sort of a way of framing some nebulous range of altered states and saying, those are kind of pretty good. And this one's over here trance can be fun, but might not wake you up, or might actually be a little damaging or a little dangerous depending on what kind of trance you're in. And it's a
or might be awesome.
Or it might be, so I'm saying it could be pretty fun, but not what we usually associate with the kind of self-reflection or the kind of clarity of meditation. Yet it's not always clear where that line goes. We've talked about the difference between how you draw the difference between hypnotism and meditation in that sense. So a lot of the meditation I've done has been involved with not doing anything, or trying really hard not to do anything, or trying hard to not try really hard to not do anything. And yes, it is recursive and paradoxical and a bit absurd. But one of the things that comes out of doing this for a long time, because I don't have any machines, unfortunately, is one becomes very aware and to some degree somewhat distrustful of the doer, the one who wants to do. Okay, I'm getting concentrated here. Like, all right, okay, I can just, if I just follow my breath, like really go for it. I'm gonna go farther. I'm gonna get deeper in. Yeah, ooh, now this is work. Okay, whoa, this is okay, cool. No, just bring the mind back. No, and that's fun, and you can go far. And some people, they meditate that way their whole lives, and some of them get enlightened. I'm not making any claims about the right way to meditate. I'm a pluralist about all this stuff. But that's not my way. So from my perspective, a lot of the problem with the kind of gadget side, like the stuff that we're kind of dealing with on a day-to-day level, leaving aside the big monster capitalist octopus nightmare thing, just the stuff that we're dealing with is that even as it might be giving you useful information that you can integrate into future decisions or giving you feedback on this thing, is that it's almost all, not all of it, almost all framed in a way that just amplifies the doer, just makes the doer more doing. Whereas what I have learned to do, because I'm a Zen guy, is I just sit in the fucking question and I don't go anywhere anymore a lot of the time. And like, maybe that's enlightenment, maybe it's not. Maybe you're like, that's why I don't do Zen, which is fine. It's a fine response. But I'm not trying to like argue from a position of knowledge. I'm just trying to, this is where I'm coming from, but what I noticed through that. And so the irony of, it's like the irony of having the device be the thing that's controlling the amount of time you use the device. That's absurd. It's hilarious. It's pragmatic. It makes sense. It's better than it not being there, but it's also absurd. Like, it also just shows how looped the thing is. And so part of the problem I have with the space of consciousness hacking as a place where people are creating new apps and new devices and new language to talk about why we're doing this and what it's going to give you and blah, 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 is that it chases away not knowing. I don't know. And while I can do certain things and respond in certain ways, say things about history or whatever that aren't totally off the mark, that on another level I just don't know. And part of being able to be genuinely empathetic, in my view, and genuinely compassionate and genuinely paying attention requires not knowing. And so what we have, not just with these devices, but just in general on the internet, is this excess of knowingness. And for me, and I say this all the time, forgive me if you've heard me talk about it before, one of the great paradoxes of our moment, to me, is that anybody with half a brain looks out there and goes, this shit is so complicated, it's moving so fast, it's so hard to even vaguely understand. Like on some basic level, any thinking person gets that. And yet, when we turn to the world of public discourse, everybody knows. Everybody is coming from a position of knowing. And I'm like, what the fuck? I mean, okay, some of these people actually think they know, fine. But a lot of these people are just hosing themselves and me and everybody and it's so dangerous. And so sometimes I'll go out into like Twitter land and just like throw out like, I don't know bombs. Like, I really don't, no, I really don't know. And it's like, you don't know what to do with it because it doesn't fit into the like point counterpoint, ganging, massifying thing. And so for me, one of the real gifts of meditation and practice in our environment right now is to more fully embrace and become used to not knowing. And the psychedelic equivalent is to fully embrace and get good at being fucking confused and having all of your maps be scrambled and you maybe are crazy. Not the like, oh, I'm one with the universe and oh, I finally see and I've got to, that's fine. But I don't think that's actually as helpful now as the stuff where you are, oh my God, I don't know how to wrap it up anymore. Because that's where we're going. And if you aren't, the choice is to increase your capacity to take on ambiguity, horror, disgust, terror, despair, whatever. I'm sorry, but you grow into that, or you get crystallized in some kind of predetermined control, perky pat layout setup where you're in your little story about I'm an agent and I'm controlling and this tool is going to give me this and I buy this thing and it makes me feel whatever. And so part of the practice, and that's what Buddhism's good on, death, man. Buddhism is good on the not so fun stuff. It's like Buddhism's a kind of a poison pill. And I think psychedelics are kind of a poison pill too, in a good way. Like it's a poison path. Both of these are poison paths. And so when I look at all this stuff, I go, that's cool. I like, data and Fitbit and measure this thing and loop it around and play with it. And I'm like, where is the support for the not knowing part, which is different than what you're talking about, what Shinzen's talking about. And I recognize that. And it may be what I'm saying is something that that on a scale level, on a mass level, isn't appropriate. But it also feels like to stay awake as we go forward into what we're going to, we need to have the capacity to be resting in really profound ambiguity, including the ambiguity, one of the elephants in the room, which is like, okay, we can't do anything really about it. So what do we do then? What does it mean to die as a world, or as a, and even if climate change doesn't happen and post-human tech, takes us into that cyberpunk future, which is not a very pleasant place. Then there's a lot about just being human that dies. All this stuff that I get from my parents and grandparents and all these old books I got and these great poems and stuff like that. There might not be much of a place for a lot of that stuff. So even if we make it through the climate change thing, there's just a lot of shedding that's going to go on. So maybe partly why we're talking about practice or Buddhism or meditation in light of technology and in our present moment is not just to maybe learn how to do something good and positive and respond to it, but also learn how to mourn and how to die or shed skin, let's say, take it out of the full extinction model, though that's obviously part of the picture too, but how to shed skin. So I don't know, I think that I can't keep, I come back to that existential perspective, but I realize that it kind of clashes with the scale model, with we got 20 years, let's get people out of their misery, out of their mental illness, and even if the technology is compromised and fat cats are getting fatter, it's still the best shot we have to make people not be as crazy. And I don't know how to reconcile those two things. I kind of the same question in a way. Sorry.
I think it is time to take questions.
Yeah, you're right. It's about 8:33.
Let's take a 10-minute break and then come back for Q&A. Does that feel?
So this is the Q&A period, and we have said no. I made a decision for us where we're not going to have a moderator.
Yes.
We'll just take questions.
That's cool.
But because this is being videoed and so on, when you ask a question, try to speak up, and we're supposed to repeat and summarize. I'm adding summarize the question. And you might want to, if you're asking one of us, you might want to point that out, or if you just want us to field it, we can do John Ken or something.
Sounds good.
Okay.
You call.
I had a question and a comment. I appreciate all that you're saying, and the ambiguity piece is very lovely. It seems like, in terms of the health space and epigenetics, are moving from the old disease model to the new integrated model, and that there's complicated systems which are like airplanes you can take apart. There's complex systems like humans that are adaptable and variant and ever changing. And so I love that we're moving in that direction, and that these gadgets, the first thing is there's no going back. We can't push them back, so they're here. And the piece around, I guess this idea that the acid test, we have to I feel my thoughts, we have to trust ourselves and trust people to work them, and the acid test is silence. I'm wondering if you just reflect on that. silence. If we can get to silence, then then that's a way to navigate. That's like a place at the baseline. And I'm just curious if you agree or what you'd add to that.
Are you saying like we just don't talk, or what do you mean
Oh
get
no,
to
just
silence?
like in using using all these techniques and all these things. If we can, if we can be at silence, they can't. That substratum that they can't get to. So I just mean in the practice.
Mm-hmm. So, how would you summarize that
That's
question?
an interesting. I don't know. I like it.
Me too. So the question is essentially, what about if we can get to silence using these interventions? And I think you mean essentially mental silence.
Yeah. Do you agree with that? And is there a way in the climate of things and the urgency to do that you would recommend or that you foresee?
Silent mind is nice, but I don't see that as that important of a state, actually, just the way I work. Whether there's lots of thoughts or no thoughts, awareness is the same, right? The ability to be with what is includes being with lots of thoughts or no thoughts. And so I don't really teach the let's all stop thinking kind of school. And so I'm unusual in that way, but that's my experience. You can be just absolutely as with the moment inside the unfolding of mental activity as with inside the unfolding of less chatter, right? So to me, that's not that interesting of a direction to make everyone's mind more quiet. I mean, you can get a quiet mind with a bottle of whiskey, and it doesn't help that much. Erik?
Well, I think that the question about silence is also, it's related to the idea that we're trying to get to a particular kind of state, and that particular kind of state delivers some good. And I think both parts of that are a little problematic, both the idea that it's about getting to a certain kind of state and the idea that a certain kind of state is going to give a certain kind of good. Like that expectation also is a little bit, and so it makes sense because there's all sorts of concrete situations we could be talking about where you're having an obsessive thought, so you want it to be interrupted, and I use CBT or I use a device and I can interrupt the thought. Okay, I produced a concrete positive result that gave me a good because I was able to interject, let's say, silence or interrupting an internal monologue or something like that. But when we're talking about the sort of deeper states like that, I think that's partly where that trouble comes up for me about what we're fetishizing a state. It's not really about a particular state. So maybe I'm misunderstanding what you mean by silence, but that's sort of how I would do it. But there's a lot of questions.
Me?
Yes.
Awesome. So my question is, hasn't this been going on the entire time? This kind of intrusion of someone into my private reality and dominating the social sphere in which I live. Whether you're talking about Christianity, adopting all the pagan things and it unfolding into this big thing, or whatever the paradigm is. It's just tech is the latest thing that we're concretizing and saying this is what's doing this to us now.
I wanted to clarify your question because I can read it in two ways. What is the thing that's always been going on? Is it that there's a control mechanism?
An encroachment on individual kind of that cognitive liberty of a self-possessed, actualized.
Okay. Great. So the question is about, haven't we always been in this game in a sense of being colonized, having our consciousness colonized, our will be puppeted by external forces? Yeah, at least since the Neolithic. I'm not going to make claims about the Paleolithic because you're just a band. There's not many of you. You're cruising along. You got a family. 20, 30 people. You can imagine that being pretty kind of not that, because everyone's just relying on each other. There's no superstructure. There's no gods. There's no standing armies, there's no bureaucrats, there's no writing, you know. So I just say we don't know about that. But once you get the state going and you need to organize larger groups of population and you realize that you can use memes or abstraction in order to create stories that allow you to control populations, and that those stories then get written down and they get reproduced in the performativity of the state and in religion. So in that sense, yes, you know, and then in some ways you can look at, like, you know, the traditions that I love, like both Buddhism and Taoism, are fuck you, get away from that shit kinds of things. Like, let's go make a monastery and get out of this and try to see what happens if we can make a more enlightened collectivity as well as a set of awakened individuals, either in the forest or in a set aside place, or, you know, in Taoism too, like to get away. Like, so there's an aspect of us. I mean, we're really weird. I mean, human beings are funny on the what they call fission fusion, right? That we can function collectively, like full on. We're all in it together. We're a band. We're a riot. We're a team. We're a religion. And we also have this capacity to be, or not even capacity, we are also profoundly alone. And that aloneness is both a freedom and a burden. And it also, and by freedom I don't mean that we're free, I mean that we can do whatever we want. Because we're only responsible to ourselves. You know, who can tell me what to be? Nobody. Oh, I'm going to be a slave? I'm going to kill myself. Sorry, can't get me in that kind of way. So there's a weird, we're both. And so, you know, that I think is part of the dynamic of civilization, is that we're wrestling with these two sides. But the question about it, so hasn't it always been this way, is like, yes, but the intensification, the power imbalance, the disequilibrium of the kind of knowledge about, so that like the control mechanism now is coming in with so much specific data about me, in a way that Christianity is just giving you a story. And, you know, maybe an individual priest is manipulating you based on what they know, but this is, the whole thing is like on it. So it's sort of like the, you know, when you're trying to understand forces and in terms of history, there's always this tension between continuity and bifurcation. You know, so here's a great example. Well, aren't we just doing genetic manipulation when we select the best breeds and breed them together? We've been doing that for thousands of years. Isn't that the same thing as genetic engineering? And it's like, well, there's a continuity view where you say, yeah, it is kind of the same thing. We're just selecting and breeding and using our intelligence to get what we want out of plants. And then there's another view where you're like, no, once we're getting down to like screwing with the DNA directly, that's a bifurcation point. That's a new thing that we're doing. So I think that where we are with technology and consciousness and culture is a lot like that. On one level, it's the same old Babylonian con that we've been stuck in for 6,000, 8,000 years, the game of the state, games of civilization. And it's hit these bifurcation points of acceleration and control and power that make it a different ball game, I think.
Hey, so when talking about the problems we have right now in society, a lot of it kind of comes from like the systems and the mainstream culture, where you're kind of told to do like this is the way to do it. And the way to kind of break free of that, to awaken, inherently means like being in the counterculture, or kind of like seeing the main culture for like the delusion that can be. So at least to me, it seems part of the job, I guess, is to help people in their awakening and like through various methods. And that could mean like democratizing, somewhat destabilizing like poison paths, as you said. So it could be psychedelics, meditation, all these different things. The one question I had was, when spreading these enlightenment teachings to a mass audience, typically a lot of this stuff is done with a teacher or a therapist or a guide. So when like distributed at a mass scale, how do you also make sure that you mitigate the destabilizing parts of it for individuals, while helping the collective enlighten or awaken to improve the world?
So your question is, how do we use such a powerful consciousness altering tool in a way that doesn't do more harm than good by destabilizing people?
Yeah, and it will do both, but how do you mitigate the harm?
Right. So I mean, it's a very fascinating question, right? Like the stronger this is, the more danger there is of destabilizing people and maybe even whole cultures. You know, the thing about the human brain, or maybe let's say mammal brains or whatever, is that they have evolved to be super stable and really keep coming back to the mean, and you can't even have people get like too far away in any particular sense from kind of the general human stream before they just start coming back to average, right? And within that, there's a little bit of room for chaos and spontaneity and stuff to happen, right? So there's this really delicate balance, and you could see very quickly how if we start messing with that balance between, let's say, chaos and order in the brain systems, and especially in the brain systems of a lot of individuals, it could get really, really crazy really fast, right? So I don't think we know enough about how that works. You know, free energy model of the brain and all that is trying to understand all that. But it's something that remains to be seen. I think that the model I was describing earlier of we're not just going to press buttons and have people instantly awake somehow, first of all, I don't even think that's possible, and it's definitely not desirable. But on top of it, even if you could do that, you know, total, you know, instant Buddhahood, you would still need a really careful classroom situation that, you know, where you talked with someone and maybe a group of people for a long time to even figure out how to integrate that into behavior, into your relationships, into everything. So to me, it does come back to a certain amount of non-technological intervention of just other people working with you like that, and of course a whole bunch of feedback from the first wave of people who are doing this into the second wave to see what we can get better with it, and then feeding back and getting better with it, and so on. So, you know, even in the vision of we're going to democratize enlightenment, the idea is that this takes a lot of time and very careful, what's the word I'm looking for? Just careful shepherding people along in this process. And still, that might reduce the time necessary by, you know, 100 times or something. So that's the idea in the good version.
Yeah, just one thing to add to that. It might be unrealistic, but one of the things that I come back to when people ask what to do and what, you know, is there's something really powerful about, you know, small bands of friends or peers or fellow explorers. And one of the things, again, that I loved about some of the conscious hacking events that I went to was, again, that DIY, we're all coming together and whatever. And now, admittedly, there's forms of privilege and access and questions about that when you're talking about levels of scale. But I don't believe it's crazy to imagine a world where the idea that these practices might help you, if you don't know anything about them, you're not a countercultural person, but you're like, hey, there's this psychedelics or whatever, and it kind of like, it's sort of scary because you have to destabilize in order to rebuild. You can't just like change it. That goes coupled not just with the idea that there's an expert or a therapist or a person who can give that to me, because as you say, that might not be there. And you know, if you look at the numbers, there's not going to be enough mental health practitioners even close to what's needed. And again, this is sort of maybe a little, you know, overly hopeful, but just that one of the main means is this is something you do together. It's something you do, even if it's just 3 or 4 or 5 people who are kind of working on this together, and even if that's still going to lead to craziness and some things that don't work and it's a disaster in some cases, that interpersonal network is, to my mind, not only one of the great stabilizers, but it's actually one of the most positive political emergences of these practices. So when I think about psychedelics, I think about these trips that I had when I was just that alone fusion, you know, the fission being off in my own little world. But that's absolutely connected to the communities that I've been blessed to be a part of. And so that idea that these are things you do alone and you're totally responsible for and totally open to God knows what, and you're doing them together. Because I don't know how much, I mean, there's going to be, if it's always about an expert, then it's going to be about expert systems. And it's going to be about AI. It's going to be about just following a series of procedures on a screen or something. So I just hope that there's a way that people can find room to connect with other people around this shared problem and possibility. And that part of the whole story is, to my mind, one of the more hopeful and doable, imaginable ways of navigating this stuff. You got a good choice here? Oh my God, I can't do it. In the back, Josh, the man gets a question.
Are you the meadow or the field?
I think I'm the field.
Okay.
So I completely agree with I think every single point you guys made, from the dangers, the pitfalls of this stuff, and Erik, your piece around capitalism and the necessity for systemic transformation to get these things in. But I think you're seeing consciousness hacking as a movement through a single lens, and that lens is state change. And for me, wisdom isn't about hedonistic states. Wisdom isn't like asymmetric pleasure. There's a deeper principle to be had here, I feel, which is, how do we actually give people access to not just pleasurable states? So that's one different type of state change, but also, if you use someone like Ken Wilber's model, wake up, grow up, clean up, show up. This is the waking up piece you're speaking to. And I feel there are far too many people saying a consciousness hacking tool is the enlightenment button. That's going to be the end goal. When for me it's not. For me that is fundamentally problematic. But if we can actually start to think about, okay, could technology support us as we move out of ethnocentrism towards world-centric perspective, stage change? Can technology support us in healing our trauma? Can it guide our nervous systems to release contractions in the body? That's kind of what I feel that is much more in alignment with what wisdom and technology is. And state change isn't wisdom. And I feel like a lot of this has been framed, Cohack is state change. Now, do I see sufficient people taking that route towards using tools to increase stages and healing? No, it's been co-opted. But I don't feel that means we should necessarily drop the endeavor of marrying tech and spirituality, but rather reorient it to say, okay, state change isn't actually that wise according to the wisdom traditions. What could be a more wise and holistic approach? Yeah, I wanted to name that distinction.
So to summarize your question, you're asking, you're saying that most of the discussion has been framed in terms of state change. What about other types of change, a la the Wilber model, not just waking up, but cleaning up, growing up, showing up? And you're saying you think that can be, that's crucial for a Cohack, and also is something we haven't really discussed. Is there a question in there exactly?
Yeah, so if I were to say to you, what do we do with technology now, given our crises? Do we drop this endeavor of marrying it with spirituality, with technology? Or do we attempt to reorient it towards deeper textures of wisdom?
For what?
Deeper textures of wisdom. I mean, you started your question saying you agree with everything we said, so I'm just going to say yes. Of course, these other dimensions of human existence or human, showing up or being or interaction or whatever are absolutely crucial, and some of them might lend themselves better, to consciousness hacking than the waking up part. And I think even if co-hacking is fairly state changey. Certainly tons of the devices are very state changey. I think both Erik and I are talking a lot about, the kind of awakening that isn't about states. But even with all that said, you could see a tremendous benefit right away with using conscious hacking type devices for growing up and cleaning up, right? My friend Judson Brewer, right, makes devices that are really, they're mindfulness based, but a lot of them are about overcoming addiction and stuff like that, and they're effective, right? And that just seems like a universal good as far as I'm concerned, and I would take that as a literal cleaning up example, right? And so there's a lot of potential low-hanging fruit there of really helping people expand the, what'd you call it? The texture of their spirituality, or the texture of their awakening in these other realms. And it, like I said, it might even be more effective that way. On the other hand, it just multiplies the problems we're talking about also, right? Well, who's in control of that, and what is the right way to grow up, or even show up? I think a lot of social media is about showing up in certain ways, right? Like getting you out there in the world, and certainly that hasn't been problematic at all. No issues there of any kind. So, each one of these, like like we're bringing in more aspects of our humanity, and just multiplies the problems. So it's Promethean. I mean, the more power we have, the more problems we create, right? And so what's the right way to work with this? Are we going to leave the fire with the gods when we can grab it? That's never happened. So we're going to grab it, but obviously there's the getting burned quality. So.
Sounds good. Yes.
Well, I really appreciate both of your, strong desire to find a solution and to fix, and you're so driven. And I think I wanted to ask you, do you think maybe we're skipping a step, because you talk about privilege, and if we look at women, or if we look at people, indigenous cultures, and the process and the capacity that we have through technology to listen. And you talk about the vulnerability of humanity, but that's also our strength when we come together as a sangam, or when we acknowledge there's such honesty and there's such truth, and all movements have come during tragedy. When people come together, there's this immense power and magic that can come together, and the capacity of technology to really listen to everybody and to go to that step before we try and fix them, it might be something that we want to look at.
I mean, there's so many different ways there's so many different potentials.
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry.
So the question is, do you think we're skipping a step by trying to fix? I know it comes from a good place.
Right.
But how can we do it if we're not including the conversations of where people are at first?
Okay, so yeah, so don't we need to go through a phase of really listening and really having everyone at the table before we try to have change? Well, yes, I think that we get into this. I'm sorry, I'm being tongue-tied because I'm kind of going meta on the question. That would be great, to be able to figure out a way to listen well. I think it is not happening now very well. So if we're going to say that's not happening now very well, and go, why is this not happening very well, we're going to get to some of these issues that we're talking about. And I would actually love to think that I had an idea of how to fix things. I feel terrible that I come up here and you're listening to me and I don't feel like I have even a faintest idea of how to fix things. I feel I'm mostly just trying to articulate what I see this conundrum we're in. So when I imagine a world where that kind of listening is possible, I mean, I follow a lot of indigenous leaders and thinkers, and I don't identify with it, but I follow it, as particularly around technology. There's some fascinating things that are happening with communications technology and media and stuff like that. And at the same time, that's this tiny little pocket over here. Nobody, it's not really penetrating. Most people don't really care. I can imagine a science fiction story where we're able to have that conversation, but it's not happening now. And so when you ask me that, it's like I would like to support you and think, yes, that's what needs to happen first, but I don't see where that's coming from, so I don't really know what to do with that possibility, because I can imagine a lot of pretty wonderful possibilities with technology, and they're even happening in some small place over here. I don't know how to communicate in that way. I didn't think it would be like this. I remember when I was in the 90s, when I was huffing on the fumes of the future, that was one of it. It was like, yes, now we get to hear it all, now we get to see it all, now we get to be truly cosmopolitan, and like watching how it got more and more not that way, even as it got more complicated and more globalist. Even inside the tech world, it took me like years to acknowledge that like the tech bro was a real creature, because I was so 90s about it. I was like, no, they're all like trans and got ear piercings, and it's just so futuristic, and like, come on, man, stop it. You're silly. So I would love that, but I'm not really sure how it happens in our contemporary environment, and it might need to happen. But I don't know where it happened.
Maybe just one person at a time.
Yeah.
And I would just like to just add to that, extending it beyond the human milieu, right? What about listening to the biosphere? What about listening to animals? What about listening to all that? And if we're going to go there, where there's this conversation is possible in some kind of sci-fi future, that's really worth doing. Yeah.
Actually, I think the young woman who was first, I saw her.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
First of all, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Mine kind of goes off the question that Josh asked before, but also touching on one of the last things you guys were talking about, which is being okay with not knowing, and how that's really important, and how technology today has created this excess of knowing, and in a negative way, making people feel more uncomfortable with not knowing. But I feel, at least from my own experience, I've grown up with an inundation of technology, with research coupled with a natural inclination to want to know the scientific answer to everything. But I feel like the plethora of information that has been available through technology is one of the things that taught me it is okay to not know, because you see so many contradicting perspectives. There's way too much out there to read. You're never going to read it all. So that was one way that I felt like technology, even though it could have that negative impact, can have that positive impact as well. Even the concept of knowing what it is to be human, like you said, with all the technology, there's a lot about being human that dies, but we don't even know that the ways of the past of being human are what it is to be human, and not these ways filled with technology that we could be moving into in the future. And I feel like it's really natural to be afraid of these changes, because that's kind of what we tend to do, be afraid of change. And I guess my point is that, kind of like what Josh was saying, there are these really positive powers and impacts of technology. We do need to produce impactful solutions faster than the world is falling apart, like you said. And I feel like technology is undeniably going to be the key to spreading those solutions as fast as possible. So I definitely hear you on all the dangers, But I also have the sense that you guys don't think that it's all doom and gloom and terrible. So I'd just love to hear a little more about your thoughts on where technology could take us in a more positive way. You know, you mentioned that one example of your friend and his machine. I'd love to hear also from you where you think it could go. I mean, we're here for the promises and perils of consciousness, and I think it's been a lot of perils. So would love to hear a little bit more on your thoughts on the promises.
Great.
Woo!
Just to repeat the prompt, it's to let's hear some promises. Let's hear some of the positive things. I could think of two things that are happening. One picks up on something I said before, and it's an aspect that's always been part of consciousness hacking as a movement that interests me and that I continue to be interested in, is how technology can support new forms of collective experience and even group mind. And while that too we can imagine, nefarious science fiction scenarios with that kind of thing. I think that because I really believe that part of our challenge now is to find new languages of connection and collectivity on a really local level and on that big level where I'm actually able to overcome all of the discursive, polarizing discourses and still be able to identify or resonate with large populations of very different kinds of people. So that's part of what's required. And it's partly a matter of empathy and understanding and intellectual awareness and maturity, but it's also partly about energy and maybe forms of experience that we don't really have much of a taste of. We do know that technology can be very good at creating Dionysian collectivities. So you can have an acid test or a psytrance party where you're just throwing all of this heavy beats, electronic sounds, and lights and beer. You get people in there and they're on psychedelics and something happens that's really kind of magical. Now that's crazy wild stuff, but there are more, contained or controlled forms of collectivity that are really powerful. And so the idea, let's say, of just using, which a lot of people have been trying different ways to do it, like how do you have group biofeedback where you're all focusing on, let's say, an object that's representing your capacity to get your rhythms in resonance. And so you're learning how, what?
The glowing orb.
The glowing orb. You're learning how to find your way into forms of a collectivity on an energetic, vibrational, unconscious, playful, magical way that the technology very much can support. So that to me is something that's both fun and partly for that reason something that people are going to do, but also has within it a really positive gesture towards different ways of being together. And whether we're talking about intentional communities or collect group homes or the ways that new collectivities are going to be forming, I think partly in relationship to a lot of the troubles that we're in, because I think part of the trouble is the way that the individual has been constructed in modernity and the family structure and things like that. That may be one of the things that's standing in the way of some of these solutions. So that's something that I see on a level of kind of technology. And then the other thing that I would say is that there is a really intense, fast-moving, pretty fascinating waking up process happening in the interstices of the discourse networks on the internet, on YouTube and podcasts and whatever. And if you get in the right vein, you come across some amazing, rogue, multidimensional thinkers navigating these spaces between the polarities, the obvious polarities. It's like there's all these big clumps of predictable kind of political, economic, futurological, what are we doing places. And then in the interstices, there are very interesting networks that are emerging. And I'm sure that there are many, many more than the ones that I see. And so even if that does, I don't know if that's going to make it happen, but it's really exciting. Because it's already part of that vibe of when a disaster happens, people get really cool, for the most part. And it's an amazing, people talk about it. How do you create that? Does it last? How do you make, can you make it happen if you want? And I think there's an element of that that's happening, where we're all more willing to look directly at the existential threat or the existential threats. And in response to that, people are like, I don't know if they're waking up more in terms of, meditative insight or Dharmic forms of awakening. Some people say so, that people seem to be waking up faster or something. I don't know. That seems anecdotal. But on a more language level, or thinking about meta systems, how do we think about multiple systems? How do we think about agency within multiple systems? How do we begin to map the fact that we can't map at all? How do, those pressures, I think, are leading to some really, really interesting ways of thinking, and that those will manifest in, even just in new ways of learning. I think podcasting is amazing. It's amazing to me. I think it's one of the best things that's happening now, because it distributes information and it models conversations. Great. It's not, some of them are interviewing, there's like kind of expert driven ones, but a lot of them are very lateral and pretty omnivorous. They're like moving in multiple directions. And people get to hear the intimacy of a human voice in a way that's, I think, much more calming, supporting, and hopeful than looking at images on a screen. That's just my flavor. Some people like to watch that stuff on YouTube. That's fine. But so I see both the kind of discursive podcast space as, for all the nasty things that are out there as well, that is a very positive sign of at least like, well, if we're going down the tubes, let's wake up as we go. That, to say it negatively, and then positively, that it's in that kind of meta-system, multi-perspectival discussions that we're going to be able to build the culture that's able to take in more, to be able to see, to be able to move in a complex space and not hunker down. So just to say one more thing, to respond to what you said at the first about how technology taught you learned ignorance, that I can only know so much, and those limitations. That's what I mean. I think any thinking person comes to that view, but for some reason that hasn't catalyzed a kind of axiomatic shift in how we think about our own knowledges, especially on a professional level. Like the professionals in whatever science you're doing or industry you're doing, they do almost the opposite, where they concretize their particular realms of knowledge and they try to make them dominant so that they can gain market share or get the research dollars or have the solution that then gets picked up. And there's tremendous pressure on those people to know. And so I think that it's like an open secret, what you're talking about. And it is a fact about technology that it shows us the multiple perspectives of things. And that's incredibly valid, it's part of my waking up, for sure. It's not, it's very much about information and modeling and systems. It's just that there's some disjunct between that, I see, and how people are acknowledging the complexity or acknowledging the need to recognize the absence of knowing, even as we have no choice but to make decisions and try to figure things out. So thank you for that prompt.
Yep. I think that's it. Time-wise, we need to end.
That's it?
Yep.
All right, kids.
Thank you.